Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dvarai. Okay, good morning, dear Chevra. This Yata D'Shmaya, we jump back into Sichos Haran, not Sichos Haran, what am I saying? Likutei Moharan. I'm looking at these sponsors and I'm not sure if she sent maybe only half of them, or maybe not. Maybe that's the sponsorship for today. We jump back into Likutei Moharan with Torah Samech with Hashem's help. Today's shir is sponsored, I hope this is all of them, by Zav Klein, L'Nishmas, his parents of Brent Street, Simcha and Ya'akov and Yeshעיהו, and as a schus for shidduchim for Yehudis, Adina, Bas, Elisheva, Rochel, Dovid ben Fayga, Kayla, Yonatan, Shimon ben Hadassah, Ronit, Netanel ben Meechal, Mahnaz, Noach, Avraham and Raizel, Zev ben Rivka, Bryndel, and all the singles of Klal Yisrael, also dedicated as a schus for a refuah shalema for Chaim Yehoshua ben Chaim Miriam. There may have been more, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what all them are. And we should only hear B'suras Tovos for all of Klal Yisrael, the Ezras Hashem, in the schus of our learning together. Amen. And we wish a very happy birthday to our dear friend Mandy. You should have a beautiful year up ahead, full of nachas and simcha, parnasa tova, everything good. Baruch Nisa v'gashmis, the Ezras Hashem. Okay, let's continue with Torah Samech. We're not going to do a huge review, but basically we're learning about the tzaddik emes and about how the tzaddikei emes had to have access to phenomenal ashiras, to phenomenal wealth. And we discovered and explored various approaches to what that means. Mishamnes Asher Moishe, the idea of psoiles, about how tzaddikim have to know the journey, right? And have to have had experiences that give them this level of clarity, like Shlomo Melech that Hevel Havalim, Hakol Havel, and to use the ashiras that they did have for holy purposes. And we learned that the way to access this ashiras is going to be through the tikkunei atik, through rectifying the aspect of atik, which is the place of the spheres in their balanced form, the earliest, highest, most unconstricted energy of the olam hatikun, of the system, right, that ends up with the spheres being in three columns, which is what we learned from the Ijurabba of Rabbi Shimon saying to Rabbi Lazar and to Rabbi Abba, that together those three were klala de Kayla, right, the idea of istaknu kayamin, where the pillars are metukan, that's coming from the world of the olam hatikun, that begins with the revelation of Atik, which is ancient, right, is higher up on the funnel. And the way to access that is by being in a state of constantly improving, or striving to constantly improve, being on the growth journey. Every day it starts off kutzer, it starts off narrow, and then it grows wider and wider and wider. And that's the aspect of Yiras Shamayim, right? Which is Yiras Haraimamos, being empowered by the overwhelming awesomeness of being alive, right? The awesomeness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world that He created, both in the grandeur of it and in the smallness of it, but just experiencing awe, right? And that can be empowering to help a person grow bit by bit, day by day, week by week, year by year, like the tzaddikim that were constantly going from level to level. And the opposite of this year of Shemayim, which is connected to the idea of Tosef Yamim, that's Arichas Yamim Atik, that gives a person wealth, which is Yiras Hashem, Hi Oitzarai, which is the concept of Ashiras, and Oitzar is the aspect of Kotzer Milamala, V'Rachav Milamata. That's how they built the storage houses, or the treasure houses, or narrow at the top and much wider at the bottom. And the idea is that that's the aspect of Arichas Yamim. The days start off Kotzer Milamala, right? They're wide at the top in the sense of they're narrow at the top from the standpoint of their outset, right? Being small, needing to wake up, and then slowly but surely increasing and increasing and increasing. It gets wider and wider and wider at the bottom. In other words, as the day carries on, and it's an aspect of the form of an Isha, which is, of course, Isha Yiras Hashem Itasalal, and that's the idea of Yiras Shamayim. Now, the opposite of that is the Hepech, is Sheker Achein, that comes from Hevel HaYoifi, right? When a person is connected to Yoifi Nashim, like we spoke about, so then there's an aspect of Sheker Achein there, and that's the opposite, counteracting the other half of the pasuk, which is Isha Yiras Hashem Hitasalal. And we found that Avram and Yitzchak, when they came to a place where there was no Yiras Shamayim, they fell into Aner Madrega Yoifi Nashim, and then They needed to rectify that with the aspect of Arichas Yamim. We had a pasuk by Avraham Avinu, right, where it says, Vayagar Avram Eretz Pelishtim Yamim Rabim, and then he had phenomenal wealth. Hashem berachas Avram Akol on account of Avram Zakin Baba Yamim. That was the tikkun of Arichas Yamim. And we ended off, we had the same thing by Yitzchak Avinu. That Yitzchak Avinu was the concept of the same idea, system Pelishtim. The Pelishtim filled up all of the be'eris that Avram Avinu was digging, and we suggested that that itself is an aspect of Yiras Haroimimos, right? Revealing the beauty and the glory and the flowing, effervescence of the nature that HaKadosh, of the natural world that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. Comes Yitzchak, same thing, right? He's not with his wife until he is mamshech arichas yamim, and that's the pasuk vayihi kasher orchu lo shama yamim, when he creates the tikkun of baba yamim, which is the aspect of arichas yamim. Then he could be together with his wife again. Vayashkem Avimelech. Avimelech looks and see Yitzchak mitzachik, and like Chazal tell us, that's what it means that Yitzchak was together back with Rivka, and that's the idea of being able to be misakin, the opposite of Yiras Shamayim, and thereby being able to draw down Ashiras, as the next psukim say, that Yitzchak Avinu dug many, many, many wells, and that he called that place Mea Sha'arim, and he was able to build phenomenal wealth as a result of having accessed Yiras Haraimamos in a place where there was previously none. Okay, that's where we're up to. Let's jump back in. We're on the top of the column, the first column on I and Aleph Amid Beis, and says the Heilige Tzaddik. Kamoisha Kasav. We'll jump back into that part about Yitzchak, and we'll continue from there. Kamoisha Kasav, right? On account of this, the Yitzchak Avinu was which is literally the words Arichas and Yamim. So then Zacha Sham Lashirs Kamashikasa, like the Psukim continue, by Yizra Yitzchak Be'aretzahi, by Yimsa Bashanahi, Mea Sha'arim. All of a sudden his wealth multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. Kimisha Ein La Yira, Ve'ein Nishmar Bebuchinas Havel Yaifi, Ayideza Ba La'anias, because the opposite of Ashiras is the aspect of the opposite of Yira, which is falling into Hevel HaYofi, the concept of the fleeting transience that draws a person in this world, which is emblematized in the beauty of women. And that leads to poverty, the opposite of Ashiras. Al tachmod yafya b'levavecha. Don't desire her beauty. It's a pasuk of Mishlei in your heart. Kiva ad isha zayna ad kikar lechem. Because ultimately, you start with this kind of mahalech, and it can bring poverty. At kikar lechem, all you'll have left at the end is just lechem, right? And that can mean on a practical level, a person begins spending lots of money on this kind of thing, and in the end, like with every addiction, it leaves you with nothing, right? And so a person is warned to be careful about that particular path and to walk with Yiras Shamayim. So the Rebbe over here engages in a very interesting mahalech to bring a second support to this, that Ashiras and Hevel HaYofi are two opposites. It's a fascinating thing. Again, like whenever the Rebbe discusses science, it was like on his level, in his generation, but of course there are metaphysical truths here, maybe there are even practical truths here. Science doesn't necessarily support this, but maybe we have yet to discover that this is in fact the case. I don't know. All these things about Chazal and science, I don't know. But this is what the Rebbe says, okay? Says the Heilige Tzaddik, Ki Ashirus ve'Hevel HaYofi him shnei hafachim. Wealth and Hevel HaYofi are opposites. Ki Ashirus hu me'arichas haneshima. Ashirus is from deep breaths. Arichas haneshima. V'Yofi hu me'hefsek haneshima. And Yofi beauty comes from the interruption of breath. What does the Rebbe mean? Because at a time when a person is emitting zera, right, in that period of time when he's together with his wife, says the Rebbe, biologically, in that moment, and this is scientifically accurate, there's a hefsek hanashima. A person holds his breath even for a split second. You can't do both at the same time. And the Rebbe says there are two reasons for this. Aleph, and again, modern science would not support this because no kesher between one and the other that I could find, at least. But Aleph is kadei shelo yiskarer hatipa al yedei haneshima, so that the tipa the zera that's leaving the body at that particular moment should not become too cold on account of the breath that a person is breathing in. Shu avir hakar, which is colder air. Shemekabel mikol rega mibachutz. The body's temperature is generally much higher, right, than the breath that we're breathing in, even if a person is in a hot climate, right? But generally speaking, the body temperature is hotter than the outside air. Kitzricha lotzes bechamimos, because that tipa needs to leave the body with chamimos. There's a bechina of gevura, of eish, with which the tipa of zera is leaving the body. And there needs to be heat, and therefore, says the Rebbe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the body in such a way where there's a hefsek hanashima in that moment, kedei shetir ro'i lo'ilada, so that the tipa zera should be prepared to bring about conception and the development of a new fetus and a new child within the womb of the mother. Okay, that's what the Rebbe says. Reason number 1. Reason number 2, v'habeiz ki machma sha'oisik koyach hadoiche lahoitze v'litches hatipa. On account of this, that the body is currently engaged in expelling something, right? There's a koyach hadoiche that the body has, which is a phenomenal koyach. Well, where did the body get that koyach from? All of a sudden, it's going from one place to the other. It's even hard to measure. Like, what mechanism is? There's an incredible koyach hadechia, right? That's pushing something out, especially with force, yer kechetz, and the lashon of Chazal, that it leaves the body like an arrow. What's that all about? Right? There's koyach hadechia. Says the Rebbe, while the body is doing that, so then al keinu be'achar hefsek hanashima. Then a person has to stop breathing in that moment. Because breathing is involved in bringing something into the body. That's the opposite of the koyach hadechia, right? So any time that a person is trying to get something out of the body, and the same is true, you could say a person's using the restroom, right? You can't breathe in at the same time that you're trying to push something out, right? A woman who's in labor, right? There's deep breaths, but when a person's pushing, right, there's a koyach hadechia. That for sure is true, right? That you're trying to push something out of the body, so that at the same time there cannot be the bringing in of ruach. Because there's a koyach hadechia in the body that's trying to expel the tipa zarius. So therefore, they cannot at the same exact moment breathing out, or breathing in, right? Breathing in and breathing out, the body is already engaged in a process of dechia. Therefore, who hefs the kanashima, that's another reason why a person needs to stop breathing. Okay, so the moment that a person is having their zera leave the body is a moment where they are only going to take their next breath post the zera leaving the body, which means that whatever oxygen is in the system is going to be the oxygen that somehow takes part in the zera that's leaving the body that will become this particular child. So says the Heilige Rebbe, the breath that a person takes before the zera leaves the body is of critical breath, because that's the breath that's in the system that's going to be leaving along with the zera. Now again, I don't know whether modern science supports this, or whether again, they will come to find out that this was the case. I don't know. But says the Rebbe, v'zeh ruach v'hahevel shenichnas mikoydim v'nishar sham. This breath that a person had taken prior to them stopping to breathe for the purpose of expelling the zera, hu mislabesh b'hakoyach hadoiche. It itself becomes part and parcel of the koyach hadoiche of the body, because the body cannot survive and function without oxygen, right? And so the body absorbs the oxygen that was just breathed in, and it is what's functioning within the body. And it is on account of this oxygen that the tipa is being pushed outward. And in accordance with the refinement and the purity of the breath that was taken, says the Rebbe, again, this is an extraordinary claim, Kain havlad meluban u'mezayres. So will the child be beautiful and meluban and whitened and cleaned and flawless. Ki im hahevel zach v'naki, because if the breath that was taken was a breath that was zach v'naki, that was a refined and beautiful breath, and the oxygen was clean and everything, So then the tipa that leaves the body, that embodied this breath that was breathed in, will also emerge clean and pure and beautiful. And therefore, the vlad, the child that develops from this, will also be meluban u'mezayres, will also be pure and fair-skinned and is using lashon of Chazal, and it will emerge very quickly, and everything will flow smoothly and beautifully on account of the fact that the beginning of the process, even prior to conception, that allowed this vlad to be conceived, was a breath that was meluban u'mezayres. Okay, a fascinating thing, an extraordinary claim. And we have to remember, like the Ramchal tells us about Chazal, that whenever they made a comment about science, it's not a science book. The Gemara is not a science book, right? Now, they were using whatever level of science they had, but because Torah is Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Side, even if the Pshat of it turns out not to be aligned with MS as our understanding grows, which is okay, that's fine, right? There's Aliyas Hadassah in certain ways, and we're able to build on the previous generation. It's an interesting thing, actually, just came to mind. When you talk about Yeridas Hadassah and Aliyas Hadassah, and people have a hard time grasping the possibility that the generations have gotten better, right? I mean, less man de polig, that technologically that's true, right? Why is it that it's like, it's so clear and obvious to everybody that we are eons beyond the technology of previous generations. Everybody understands that. And at the same time, the concept of Aliyas Hadassah in any other place is impossible. Right? Of course there's a Bechin of Aliyas Hadassah in Ruchnius as well. Now, it's building on the first principles of the previous generation's discoveries that were discovered, of course, but of course things develop and evolve. The more access to Torah we have, the more integration we have, the more Klal Yisrael gets back together and communicates in Ashkenaz and Sfard, and we know what's going on. And of course the Torah is multiplying and developing and evolving in millions of ways. And so, on the level of science, it's for sure true there's been Aliyas Hadassah. So the Ramchal writes in Adina Morim, I mentioned this in the past, that even if on the level of Pshat, it's not accurate, right? And we know that there aren't windows in the sky, that the sun passes through it, all this kind of stuff, right? We know that that's for sure not true. And the Ramchal actually brings that Gemara as an example, the Gemara in Tainis. Says the Ramchal, the level of Side is always true. In other words, even if the science that they were operating from, which is unbelievable because our whole books on Torah and Chazal, and Torah and science, and like trying to somehow twist ourselves into millions of pretzels to find a way to say that Chazal had to be right. And it's like this little paragraph from the Ramchal just resolves the whole thing. He says, no, of course it's not true that Chazal had to know science. Like, why would you have to say that? They were human beings who lived when they lived, and they were operating from the science of their time. That's fine. But the side was always accurate. So Ramchal says that any place that you see science that doesn't seem to be like good science, right, that aligns with what we understand today, double click, it'll open its cover, and on the level of side, everything that they said was true because side is preserved. It's a remarkable teaching from the Ramchal that I don't see it included very much in the conversations about these sort of conflicts between Torah and science. On the level of sight, it's true, and you can apply the same thing over here to the Rebbe, right? Whether or not it's true, and it can be proven scientifically even, right, that the breath and the air, and what does even mean, the air quality, what does it, what does this mean? When you take a breath, that's going to impact how the child looks. It's, like I said, it's a dramatic and remarkable claim. But on the level of metaphysics, of course there's MS here, without a question. Remember that we learned actually in a previous Torah about clean air. Remember, we learned about clean air. We learned about air that is necessary for messages to travel very, very far. We learned about this in Torah Yud Zayin when we spoke about Gerim, right? That all of a sudden they start to find in their own Sfarim the hepech of their Amunah, right? And that happens because the air is clean, and there are messages that are able to travel mirachik, right, from the side of Kedusha to other places. And over there, the Rebbe said, what is air that's clean? The Rebbe said love. The Rebbe said when there's love in the air, then the air is clean, then communication could take place, right? Then the wires are not getting crossed, and there's real clear seeing of each other that can happen across air that's zach. He uses almost the same lashon over there. And so perhaps you can take that and apply it here to say that that's one level of what's being discussed. And that for sure, metaphysically, in all the Sfarim HaKadoshim, right? If that relationship is taking place in an environment that's not appropriate, that's not with Ava, right? And it's happening on account of either the lust of the husband or any other reason that isn't Ava and working on the relationship, and that experience is taking place in a greater context of a real soul bond that's been cultivated over years, right, in the appropriate way. So then, of course, that's going to impact the nature of the child, right? And we have a huge literature on the way in which the parents' thoughts and the parents' actions and all different kind of considerations can actually go ahead and impact the child, and that we find all over. So if you utilize that and you take this conversation outside of a purely scientific one and into one of a spiritual, metaphysical realm, so then it becomes much more intelligible and understandable. So says the Rebbe, therefore, we learned that if the breath is air, that now we'll say is air in an environment of Ava, the way that it's supposed to be, so then the Vlad is able to reflect that Sachos and Nikios. But says the Rebbe, but if there's achirus, if something's clogged up, if it isn't clean, pure, beautiful air, as an akar tipa gamkin, that's going to have an adverse effect on the tipa. That's why the pasuk in Tehillim says the Rebbe, Adam la hevel dama, which literally means the human being is compared to hevel, compared to vapor, right? It means it's very transient. We're here today, we're gone tomorrow. We spoke about that yesterday. But the Rebbe learns this al pi pshat, in his, I say, much more pshat oriented. He says, no, it means what it literally says. Adam, the nature of the human being, la hevel dama, will be comparable to the hevel of the breath that was breathed by the father prior to conception. Ki kefia hevel, keinis havas havlad. The pasuk is telling us that the Adam, the mensch, is going to rely on Mahevel Dama, right? What was the breath like that the father breathed in prior to the neshima being interrupted for the purpose of pushing that tipa zarius lachutz to the outside? V'zebechinas, another pasuk. Ach hevel b'nei Adam. Ach hevel b'nei Adam. B'nei Adam are reliant on the hevel, again, on the breath of the father. Ki hevel hu malabein u'mezarez havlad. Because in order to bring about b'nei Adam, real human beings, like the Rebbe says in many places, that the human being is a person who's activated with consciousness, not just a behema in the form of an Adam. In order to make a ben Adam, ach hevel, right? It comes on account of the breath that's being absorbed by the koyach hadechia of the body and then pushed to the outside. V'zebechinas hevel hayofi. Another pasuk, hevel hayofi. Yofi, the beauty of the child, of this infant that's going to develop into a whole human being, is reliant on hevel. Hevel hayofi. Ki yofi hu kefi hevel k'niskolel. The Rebbe brings 3 different psukim to prove this idea. Nimsad emerges shehevel hayofi, that the hevel of the yofi, who may hefsek hanashima, is from the stopping of breathing, which will allow the breath that we took to become embodied in that tipa zarius. V'alkein, therefore, misha chomed yofi hanashim, a person who is completely drawn after yofi hanashim, and that's his whole life. Nimsa shemekabel b'chinas hefsek hanashima. So, in a certain sense, he's drawn after a world of breathlessness, which itself is reflective of the idea of reactivity, right? When a person is in a stressed state, an anxious state, their breathing is very shallow, right? They're very, very intense. There's an aspect of the opposite of arichas neshama, and that's the reactivity. A person's drawn into a place where they don't have the ability to stop and to reflect and to measure, and they're just completely taken over, right? Which is the opposite of being able to live like a human being. That's what we learned. A human being is responsiveness. That's seichel as opposed to dimyan, right? That's adam as opposed to behema, like we learned in a previous Torah. And so the whole thing is hefsek hanashima, because that's where yofi comes from, like we learned. From the person stopping to breathe and then the breath being drawn down into the koyach hadachia that's pushing the zera to the outside of the body. And therefore it's the opposite of wealth. Because wealth, says the Heilige Rebbe, is from the opposite. Wealth is all about deep breathing, not being reactive, not being impulsive, right? But to be slow, play a long game, right? Not to be so reactive. Wealth is from arichas haneshima. Ki kol mini ashiros, dainu kol mini dagon v'choli lanes v'hasavim v'chol mini matachos. Everything that exists in the world, in the physical world, that results in plenty, everything, on the level of doimim, which is minerals deep in the water, and even on account of Samech, of grain, right? And then obviously it doesn't have to go ahead and say cattle, right, which can only survive on account of the grain that they're eating, which is growing on the earth, so that's included. Himrak ayidei geshamim. They're only sustained on account of rain. If you don't have rain, nothing grows. Everything dies. There's no wealth, there's no value, there's no life, there's nothing. Right? Everything relies on the rain. All the treasures in the world, it all relies on rain. As the pasuk says, Yiftach Hashem lecha es oitzrei hatayv lasis mitar artzecha. Kodesh Baruch Hu will open up for you oitzrei hatayv, his good treasure house, which means lasis mitar artzecha. It all relies on rain. V'hageshamim, now the rains, heim bechinas haneshima, they come on account of breathing, shemachnisin umekablim avir menachutz, because they receive the air minachutz. It's all through the clouds. That is an aspect of the winds, right, that are blowing the clouds together. Kamashakasu, as the pasuk in Eov says, minishmas kel, from the breath of Hashem, yitain kerach, ice forms, v'roichayv mai b'mutzak, and the waters freeze in their flow, right, in the waves. V'zebachinas hain asher kiryas uzay. The wealth of a person, kiryas uzay, is on account of the kareach, which comes from cold air, right? The kerach, the ice. It all comes minishmas kel, from the long breath of the divine, so to speak. Shuavir hakar, which is the cold air that we spoke about from the standpoint of the hefsek hanashima of a person whose koyach hadoicha is pushing the vlad bachutz, needs to have a hefsek hanashima. On account of this, said the Rebbe, and the first reason that the tipa zarius doesn't grow too cold, over here it's the opposite. Ashiris is ice, cold air. Because it's constantly receiving air from the outside, which is the opposite of what we learned about in terms of the conceiving of a child. Kiryas uzay, and that's the aspect of kiryas uzay. So kirya is an aspect of kar, right, which is koreach, the aspect of the ice that's a result of cold air, and then uzay is a bechina of the rain, which is a bechina of wealth. Kiryas uzay, bechinas geshem mitrais uzay. Uzay is associated with rain, and that's associated with kar, the cold air, which is the kireach, that is a result of nishmas kel, which is nishima, which is breathing. And so you see that ashiras is related to deep breathing, and yoifi nashim is associated with hefsek hanashima, right? And when you, again, the Rebbe makes everything, it's very complicated with all the psukim and all the svaras and everything. But you just take a bunch of steps back and you simplify, right? You look at the idea of wealth and a person who builds wealth over time in a calculated way, in a calm way, not in an impulsive way, buying and selling things, but playing the long game, right? And that's a responsive energy, especially if a person does so with the consciousness that we've discussed now many times of masa umatan be'emuna, which we learned is all about calm, right? And not this urgent compulsion into, like a person's, helter-skelter, scatterbrain, trying to run away or trying to run around like a chicken without a head to make a buck. Everything is calm, slow and steady. That's the idea of ashiras. And Hevel HaYofi is the opposite. A person is Hefsek HaNeshima, like we learned, it's a reactive state of being constantly drawn after, and a person can't live and they can't function and they don't feel like they're centered in their Bechira, they don't feel like they're centered in their humanity. It's like a behemoth, it's just totally reactive, right? And it requires a lot of work to climb out of that and be able to identify the human inside and anchor in that mindset and become identified with that higher self so that we can be in a state of Bechira and be in a state of choosing. So that's just on the most basic level. Ashirus is responsivity, deep breathing. Hevel HaYofi is Hefsek HaNeshima. And what the Rebbe is trying to do is explain why one is the opposite of the other. Because we said Ashirus relates to, or relies upon Yiras Shamayim, which is Yiras Haraymamos. And Yiras Haraymamos is the aspect of Isha Yiras Hashem Tis'alol. And on the other hand, you have Sheker HaChaim, Behevel HaYofi, which is associated with the opposite of Ashirus, because Kiva Ad Isha Zayna Ad Kikar Lechem. That brings about poverty. And that's why you find that the Avos HaKadoshim, Avraham and Yitzchak, like we said, who brought about Yiras Shamayim on account of having access to Arichas Yamim, like we learned, over there, they were able to overcome the aspect of Hevel HaYofi until they were able to be with their wives, having fixed that issue, and now it was able to be in the proper way, and that led to tremendous ashiras. Okay, so that's how we're basically setting this up. So thematically, it's much more simple, even though it seems very complicated, and you know, with all the psukim, it's like a whole network of psukim here. But if you just zoom out and look at it on a more simple thematic level, that's what we have on either side over here. So now the Rebbe brings a bunch of Ramazim to this effect. V'zesh Kosov, and this is the pasuk that says Hayesh b'havlei hagoyim magshimim, which literally means, can any of the havlei hagoyim, can any of the idols of the nations of the world, magshimim, can any of them bring rain? So the Rebbe learns this in a much deeper way, based on the hakdamas that he revealed. Ki b'havlei hagoyim, because generally speaking, by the hevel of the Eina Yehudim, she'im b'chinas hefsek hanashim b'chinas hevel hayofi aniska la'el, where generally speaking in that culture the most valued thing in the world is hevel hayofi. So therefore there is an aspect of hefsek hanashima. So ein sham b'chinas geshamim. Then there can't be geshamim ki geshamim himrak al yidei anashim b'chinas la'el, because geshem comes from the opposite, right? Geshem comes from a very mature, wise, responsive state. And generally speaking, if you have a culture where, you know, everything is just about addictions, so then you don't have that presence of mind, you don't have that ability, and just on a practical level, everybody's dishing out tons and tons and tons of money on account of supporting their addictions, which the whole world is stuck in, thinking that the most important thing in the world is pleasure. So what you have then is chevra who are just stuck, right, without the ability to play a long ball game because they're taking out loans to support this addiction, that addiction, the other addiction. And that's generally speaking what the standard may be at least perceived as being. It's hard to make huge generalizations like that, but generally speaking, that's what the culture is. So ein sham geshamim, ein sham neshima, because there's no breathing. V'zebechinas hain mehevel yimat. Hain mehevel yimat. Wealth is even less than vanity. But says the Rebbe al yidei hevel, what it means is on account of hevel, or the lack thereof, on account of a lack of breathing, nisma'it hahain. That's going to make the wealth go further down, because wealth is coming from a responsive state, and a person who's in a state of Yiras Shamayim, that's going to bring about the ashiras that will lead to the hisboinenus that we've been speaking about all along. V'zebechinas, another pasuk there in Mishlei, v'kar ruach ish tivuna. And ish tivuna is kar ruach. So a person who's not so fiery, a person who's not so reactive, can make a person very impulsive and they're acting right away. But an ish tivuna is a kar ruach, right? Their system is calmer, colder, not cold like not in a nice way, but cold in a rational way, thought out way. The kar ruach ish tivuna. So the Rebbe over here because he's bound up a lot of different concepts together. Once we've bound his spoinus up with Ashiras, and we showed how in order to get his spoinus you need Ashiras, and we bound Ashiras up with Yiras Shamayim, and then we bound Yiras Shamayim with the opposite of Hevel HaYofi. So now the Rebbe says, okay, once you have the opposite of Hevel HaYofi, which is Arichas Hanashima, so Karuach, which is Arichas Hanashima, that's the aspect of Ashiros from the pasuk of Hayin Ashir Kiryas Uzai, which was the aspect of Yitin Kireach, that it was a result of Minishmas Kel. So once you have Karuach, so then you skip all the madregas of Yiras Shamayim, Ashiras, you go straight to Ish Tivuna. That's what's going to give a person access to Tivuna. Al Yedei Kar Ruach, Shu Ruach HaKar Shal Hanashima, That will bring you all the way from Yiras Shamayim to Ashiras, all the way to the Hispoinus that we were speaking about Shabbat, that comes to a person's life on account of the Ashiras that he was able to access, on account of the Yiras Haraimus that we were speaking about, which is a responsive spirit, not to be drawn down into the ego of the self and that very stressful, reactive kind of energy, but instead to be overwhelmed with the grandeur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and take deep breaths and to be able to just enjoy that and bask in that light. That's the Yiras Haraimus that will lead to Ashiras, that will then lead to Hispoinus. So, Kar Ruach Ish Tevuna. V'zeh, and this is also the aspect of another pasuk in Eov, V'nishmas Shakai Tevinem. Tevinem, which is Bina, Tevuna, Hispoinus, is a result, again, of Nishmas Shakai. Ki Iker Hispoinus Al Yedei Hanashima. He's bringing so many sources to support this. Unbelievable, right? Because it's a very radical, it's a very far out kind of concept, right? So he's bringing lots and lots of psukim to show that there's sources for this, albeit al pi remes. V'nishma shakai tevine ki ikers haspoinus al yedei anashima, because it all comes on account of the breath bechinas kar ruach keniskala el ki iker tikana seichel ho al yedei anashima, because the primary rectification of seichel, like we learned, is on account of deep breathing. Ki ikra seichel shahaya al tikunai shiyuchel is bainin ha'yidei ashmanim shabukuf. Now the Rebbe explains something a little bit different, where he says that the truth is seichel, which is the aspect of hispoinus, which we said you get to on account of deep breathing, which is the aspect of your Yiras Haraimus that becomes the vessel for Ashiras that leads to hispoinus. Says the Rebbe, there's a much closer connection between hispoinus, which is intellect, and Nishima. How so? How is Seichel reliant on Nishima in a much more linear way? So here the Rebbe makes another foray into science, so again, is presenting something that is hard to understand through a modern lens, but this is what was the prevailing belief at the time, and again, maybe is still true, at least on some level. Says the Heilige Rebbe, Ki Iker Tikana Seichel Al Yedei Anashim. In a much more linear sense, it is true that the brain's functionality is on account of the breath. Ki Iker Seichel Shial Tikuna Shiyuchel is Bainin Al Yedei Ashmanim Shabaguf. Because the primary Seichel and its functionality, that it should be able to really contemplate and think things through in a deep way, Al Yedei Hashmanim Shabaguf, is on account of the oils, on account of the different secretions within the body. So the Rebbe gives a mashal, ki ha-seichel hu kamay ner hadoilik. The Rebbe says this in other places also, in Timyana, Torah Ches, and in Torah Hey. The seichel is like a burning candle. Ki hu doilik ayidei ashmanim shenimshach in elav. Because in order for the seichel to function, and this is certainly true about the blood, right? The blood, it's like the heart's functionality is on account of the brain, right? That's keeping the whole body functioning, because without the brain, the person's dead. But the brain, conversely, can't function if there's no oxygen heading to the brain through the blood that's flowing to the brain, right? So it's like there's this symbiotic reliance where, on the one hand, the body's reliant on the brain but the brain is also reliant on the body, and that's for sure true. So the Rebbe likens this to a candle where the flame, right, is consciousness that's flickering on top. But the only way that the flame can flicker and then illuminate the room and illuminate the candle, which is what it gives the candle itself in a separate bechina, is on account of the wax, right, that's being drawn up through the wick and into the flame that's burning. Says the Rebbe, that's how it is with our consciousness and our body and the different, what the Rebbe calls shmanim, the different, it's a good word, fats, but in a more medical sense, different secretions, the different liquids of the body that are being drawn up, especially in the context of blood, to the brain. Fluids. Shkayach, right? The fluids in the system. Beautiful. So says the Rebbe, it's like the oil, right, or wax that is being drawn up through the wick and supporting the fire that the flame should flicker. When if the body is completely dried out, so then the seichel begins to weaken, and this is what happens when people get very old, right? The seichel starts to, even if a person doesn't have like dementia, very, very old people, they start to forget things. It's just the way that it goes. And says the Rebbe, that's because there's something that the body is not as agile, right? Or I'm not thinking of the right words, but the body is not sending the same level of viscosity, maybe that's the word, up to the brain, right? And then the brain is not able to function in the same way. And from this comes mishugayim, person becomes a little bit insane, not able to think properly. Could happen that the body becomes completely dried out, and on account of that, the brain is not able to function, and it's like the candle that has no oil left to burn. And if it's not getting oil, if somebody comes and they take the bottom of the wick and they stick it outside of the of the cup that was filled with oil, the flame is going to die because it has no more fuel to draw upon. Now the Rebbe says, the preservation of the leichus, of that sense of liquid and shmanim and oils within the body is on account of the breath. Because the Zohar Kadosh says, "Ki ilmali kanfei re'ah denashven aliba," if it wasn't for the lungs, right, that were constantly breathing right upon the heart, havaliba oiked kol gufa, the heart would consume the whole entire body. The heat of the heart, without being calmed down on account of our breathing, it would heat up the whole body. It would, on account of heating up the body, dry out the whole body, because that's what heat does, right? Heat is the opposite of cold, right? Where it causes something to become very, very dried out. So fire is associated with dryness. Water is, of course, associated with liquid. So says the Rebbe, it emerges that breathing supports viscosity, the liquid, and the liquid in the body supports consciousness, seichel. Nimtza, it emerges she'ikar kiyim shamnunis v'leichus shabaguf hu al yedei anashima, that the primary shamnunis in the body is on account of the neshima, because that prevents the body from drying out. Shemekabalas hareya ruach kar mibachutz lekarer halev. It all goes back to the krirus, right? We are achieving krirus, and we are calming down the heart, cooling down the heart, and therefore enabling the body to retain its liquid without it drying out. And then the flame is able to flicker strongly because it's able to continue to draw on the liquid of the body, which enables it to burn and flicker with his spinniness. And that's the pasuk in Meechal that we're all familiar with. Ner Hashem nishmas Adam. Says the Heilige Rebbe, what this means is that the neshama of a person is Ner Hashem. Ner Hashem nishmas Adam. How so? Neshama is the aspect, we just had the pasuk, nishmas shakai tevinem. It's associated with seichel. Nishmas shakai tevinem. Why is neshama associated with seichel? Because ner Hashem nishmas adam. Because the way that the body is formed is likened to a candle, where you have the flame on top and you have the candle itself on the bottom, and that's ner Hashem relies upon nishmas adam, upon the breath of the human being. She'ikar kiyam v'tikun ner Hashem shua seichel, because the primary sustaining of the ner Hashem, which is the seichel, neshima, is through the nishmas adam. Nimtza, it emerges, we see from here, shal yidei yira zoichin la'arichas yamim. That from all of these proofs, the fact that neshima is the opposite of hevel hayofi being the opposite of non-yira shemayim, and the opposite of short breath is ashirus, right? So you find that yira shemayim, which is the opposite of hevel hayofi, the way that we describe, because the beauty of a child is resultant from the hefsek neshima, and so deep breathing is associated with wealth, like we said. That leads to yira shemayim. Yira shemayim leads to wealth. Wealth leads to esplendidness. And then a much more linear second proof, which the Rebbe brings here, is simply that when we breathe, the heart is able to do its job of maintaining the shmanim shabaguf. That becomes the fuel for the candle of consciousness, and therefore it is true, says the Rebbe, that yira shemayim, which is associated with deep breathing, is going to enable a person to achieve his spinniness. In the first proof, he includes ashirus in there, because that's an aspect of the deep breathing, and that's the opposite of the poverty that's brought about by the reactive consciousness of hevel hayofi, daika. And over here it's the opposite, and it's the bechin of isha yiras Hashem hitis halo, right? Where it's not about the sheker achein and the hevel hayofi, it's about the yira shemayim that then can bring a person to ashiras, that then enables a person to access this level of his spoinanus. And again, of course, he's describing a tzaddik emes, right? A true tzaddik, like we're about to see in a minute. All of us are supposed to be striving, each one in our own madrega, to access these levels, but he's describing, right, the tzaddik hashalim, how he gets to that point in his spiritual development. Now here the Rebbe continues and he adds another condition. Ushleimus hayira, in order to have shleimus hayira, hi bebechina shalish kavin. It's the aspect of three kavin, three lines. There are three kinds of yiras that a person needs to have in order for his yira to be complete. Number one is moira shemayim. That's what we spoke about, yira shemayim, that tremendous awe, especially if it's a result of ahava, which we said is the bechina of yiras Hashem. Here he says yiras shemayim in Chanami, but over there we said yiras Hashem. It's a rigid fear, but it's gvura, but it's gvura shebechesed, right? It is catalyzed by tremendous ahava that a person feels toward Hashem, that a person feels Hashem feels toward them. The awe of yiras haraymamas. And then there's Moira Rabach, there's respect for one's Rebbe, and then there's Umayra Ava'im. There's Yira of a mother and a father. So says the Rebbe, Kishish Chacham Adar, Shazaych L'Talmidim Agunim L'Vadim Agunim. When you have a Chacham Adar, when you have a Tzaddik Adar, like Rashbi, who is the aspect of Talmidim Hagunim and Banim Hagunim, who has proper Talmidim and children who are proper in terms of their respectfulness and are being raised in the appropriate way. So then, Azai Hayira B'Shleimus, then the year is complete. Ki Yiras HaChacham Rav Shabadar B'chinas Mara Shemayim, the Yiras Shemayim that the Chacham and the Rav Shabadar, the Tzaddik HaEmes has, is the Shleimus of Yiras Shemayim. V'atalmidim yesh lehem yiras harav. The talmidim have yira for the Rav, b'chinas moira rabach. V'habanim yesh lehem moira ava'im, and the children have the Indian of moira ava'im. Sha'al yad ha'yidei shalish yiras elu. When you have that construct, then all the yiras are complete. The parent / teacher has yiras shemayim, so there's a humble spirit of him connecting to his source. But then we know that Es Hashem Lekechem Tira, right? The S is L'Rabbos Talmidei Chachamim. Our respect for and venerate, right, and to look up to the Tzaddikei Emes is on the level of Meir Shemayim. Wow, right? Espene Adon Hashem. The Tzaddikei Emes are reflecting, right? Darajbi, like we said, that's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is reflecting the energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They have access to this open channel to a realm beyond. On account of their Yiras Shemayim, we have Moira for them, and children have Yira also on account of their parents themselves having Yira of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then all of these three Yiras are B'Shleimus, and of course that was true for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And that's what we're going to get back to the end of the Torah. That was the part of the Itra that we read right in the beginning, where Rashbi says, Anan klala de Kayla. We contain all of the Kavim. Because Rashbi's Yira was Yiras Shemayim. Then Rabbi Lezer ben Reb Shimon is Yiras Abba. And then Rabbi Abba is Moira Rabach. Now says the Rebbe, this will finish, Ubechinas Yira shal kol echad mea shalosh hanal, tzarech sheyakalo mishalosh shalosh. But each of these three Yiras has to be inclusive of all the other three. Okay, and we're going to continue with this tomorrow, because here we're speaking about how each of these three pillars, which in the Olam HaTikun is the pillar of Chesed, and the pillar of Gevura, and the pillar of the Amuda de Emseisa, that's how the spheres are arranged in a form of Tikkun, where they have this symbiotic relationship, and they're therefore able to bring about progressively something more perfect, more perfect, more perfect. Each one is going to be kolel from Shalish, and we're going to learn about that tomorrow. That's a bechina of Chachma bin Adas, Chesed Gvur Tiferes, Netz Achoid, Yisaid, that work their way through all of these three years that were represented by Rabbi Shimon, which is the Amudah de Emseisa, and the aspect of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Abba, and we'll get to that tomorrow. V'siyata d'shmaya. Okay, Yashika, thank you so much for joining. Have a wonderful day up ahead.
ואתה האב שלי שכל כך אוהב אותי, האב שלי מלך חי וקיים על כל נשימה שאני